Good afternoon. In case you didn't notice, we've opened the windows so you can see the vessel in the afternoon sun. But next, I'm so excited to welcome Daniel Arsham. As a New York-based artist, he straddles the line between art, architecture, and performance. Arsham makes architecture do things it's not supposed to do, mining everyday experience for opportunities to confuse and confound our expectations of space and form. As a reminder, for the Q&A, we will once again be using Slido, that is sli.do, and the password is DN2022. Please submit all questions with your name, and Design Nation staffers will let you know when to go to the mics and ask your questions. And now I'll let Daniel take it away.
Discussion. The sort of interesting thing that's happened quite significantly in my work over the last 10 years is sort of two concurrent projects. One that really thinks about and investigates how we perceive time, how we package time. And I do this through the transformation of objects that are from our everyday experience. So imagine if we took a camera or a cell phone, a sneaker or a basketball, right? Something that we might identify with this moment in time, and we pushed it into the future through a material transformation that reforms that object in crystal or volcanic ash. So imagine if you went to a museum 1,000 years from now and you might find an archeological object that is from the era in which you lived, but how could we see that object today, right? This is the sort of grand or the larger project that I've been thinking about. And it is sort of the evolution of some of the early concepts that I worked with in my own work, which were around this sort of man-made versus the natural world. I've also heavily collaborated with many different brands, with Nike and Adidas, with Tiffany and Porsche and Dior, with Pokemon Company out of Japan for the last number of years. And I think as an artist, you know, certainly in the beginning, there was some question around, you know, how should an artist allow his work to be used or her work to be used in the context of a marketing scenario or in the service of selling something. And my perspective was that an artist should be making work in some senses for everyone, right? And not all of us grew up in places where we might find art. And so these were often ways that I might bring my work to audiences which are kind of outside of the traditional art world, right? Outside of museums and galleries, right? Bring the art out into people's everyday experience and lives. Been able to work on some really incredible projects personally with Porsche, for instance, working through the design ethos, right? If we think about a design object that has existed since 1965, the Porsche 911, the evolution of that design, right? The transformation of that car form over those decades, in many ways really captures the zeitgeist of an era. If we look at a 1965 911, all of the design cues in it feel very much like a encapsulation of that moment in time. And that's been a very fascinating project for me to be able to investigate the way that we think about a design ethos through one specific object. And I don't really think there's many other things that we could think about that could move through time like that and really encapsulate an era. I think maybe the other one that comes to top of mind would be like a telephone, right? A telephone, the design of it in the 1940s versus the 1980s, it captures a lot of the design sentiment and feeling around an era, right, in that object. And for me, there's a big fascination between how we link time to things, how we package our experience of time in many ways through our aesthetic experience of objects. Also, for the last couple of years, I have been the creative director for the Cleveland Cavaliers, which unfortunately lost last night to the Nets at Barclays. But we did beat the Knicks the week before that. So the Cavs, I grew up, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, spent time there as a child, and the Cavs was a very special team for myself and my family. I began the project 2 years ago as the creative director of the team. So what does that mean? It is effectively everything that the team is engaged with that doesn't have directly to do with basketball. So all of the court designs, the jersey designs, all of our sort of outward-facing design parameters are sort of curated through the lens of my studio. And it's been a kind of amazing opportunity. If you think about, you know, in many places, the sports teams sort of embody a city, right? They, certainly in New York, you know, Yankees hat is very prevalent, and it doesn't always mean a relationship with baseball. So that sort of link with sports has fascinated me as a signifier of a kind of place and an era. Currently in the process of investigating the design for the Cavs logo as it moves forward, you know, into the future, and really looking back at the design ethos of it in the 90s, in the 80s. The team, you know, was founded in the late 70s. Much like the 9/11 design, there is a zeitgeist and a kind of encapsulation of a moment in time, like a feeling around those design parameters. And so kind of all of the different facets of my practice and my career have always engaged the ways in which design and aesthetics influence our experience of time, I guess I could say. So apologies for the little glitch with the presentation. I recently was in Doha, in Qatar, in preparation for some projects around the World Cup, which is happening there. And Virgil Abloh had an exhibition in Doha, and I gave a talk there on his work. So that's a whole other discussion. But you know, while we're on it, I think one of the great things that Virgil was able to do was combine elements from all of his interests into one sort of overarching practice. And he did it in a way that was very, I would say it felt, you know, as a colleague and a friend, sort of very obvious in some ways that those things could be integrated, right? For us, Jordans and, you know, the integration of music culture and streetwear and all of those things felt very much part of our everyday experience. But I think being able to integrate those and treat the design of a hoodie in the same way that you might treat the design of a chair or a car, you know, or a water bottle, all of these things can have the same sort of meaning in them, right? Or potential ideas, right? A vehicle for ideas. So maybe what we'll do is open it up to questions a little bit earlier. It'll give us a little bit more time with that.
Yeah, that sounds
great. How does
great.
that sound?
Yeah, so everyone please take a moment and submit your questions through Slido. And then in the meantime, I have a question. So you talked a lot about encapsulating an era. So from your projects like Snarkitecture, Films of the Future, being the creative director of the Cavaliers, what era would you say has been your favorite, and what era would you say you grew the most?
So, you're talking about a couple different projects. Snarkitecture is another design studio that I founded in 2008 with a partner who is an architect. And part of the intention with that was to allow my work to exist in areas that were a little bit more, let's say, functional, right? If we think about what is the difference between, I don't know, design and art or architecture and art, we often associate design or architecture with some sort of function. You could still say maybe art has a function. You guys still there? Lost you for a second.
Yeah, we're here.
Okay. So art, it has a function, but its function is, let's say, more abstract, right? It's not as defined. And Snarkitecture allowed me to, do things like we've designed all of the Kith stores in the world. We've worked with hospitality. We've designed, restaurants and hotel rooms in Tokyo. Something that's a little bit more, let's say, specifically functional.
Perfect. So now we're going to call Dimitri to ask his question.
Hi, pleasure to meet you. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
So the question is, how do you imagine design will evolve over the next decade? And I'll keep that as open as possible.
Well, I think the big sort of question that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how our digital experience of the world is going to influence how we engage with people, with ideas in the future. I think the idea of the metaverse and NFTs and all of this sort of exploration of digital space is very fascinating. I think to a lot of people, it's certainly interesting to me as an artist. It's a bit scary, and I have a lot of questions about how those things might be used for positive influence in our experience of the world, because I'm so very much interested in things that exist which can have emotional possibilities in their design. And I don't yet know how that's going to translate in digital space.
All right, so for our next question, we have Janelle Heisen.
Hi, my name is Janelle, and first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming to speak today. I've been a huge fan of your work, ranging from like Pokemon to Dior to Porsche, of course, and I also have seen a little bit of the Films of the Future work from 2014, so huge fan.
Thank you.
But my question is kind of regarding the note you talked about earlier about kind of accessible design and it being digestible to people overall, and it's also on the note of what separates good art or design from works that really leave a lasting impact. So is excellent art something that you define as being digestible and also being able to be appreciated by any audience, or is nuance or a great amount of sort of hidden detail that's more that meets the eye essential to being excellent, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there is so much terrible art in the world, and all of it is great. Every single gesture that is a creative potential. So what is art? If I had to define it, for me it's finding another vehicle for communicating something which cannot necessarily be communicated in the typical fashion of how we engage as humans, right? We communicate through language, certainly through emotion, through basically all of our other senses, and art is a vehicle that is cross-border. It doesn't use language in the same way, right? When I'm looking for things in my own work that are going to be subject matter, I'm trying to find things that may be equal or at least equally understood in diverse locations. So I could show an object or a sculpture in Tokyo or New York, Sao Paulo, Brazil. All of these places might interpret it the same way. And so when thinking about how to define, is there really anything, is there really such a thing as bad art? I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Thank you.
Perfect. So now we're going to have a question from Kayla.
Hi, my name is Kayla. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today, virtually.
Thank you.
I was wondering if your art were to be dug up in an archaeological find in thousands of years, what comments do you think they would make about what aspects of the current time period are reflected in your pieces?
It's a very interesting and strange question, to try to answer. So I'll often have comments when I show a work, on Instagram or something, the aliens are going to be so confused when they find this in the future, because it's taking the current context of time out. It'd be like if you found somehow a computer that was from the Renaissance era, right? It would immediately disassociate and dislocate time. And actually that's another way to describe, for me, the sort of interest that I have in time travel is I'm interested in things that can dislocate us in time. Can they make us feel that we are maybe outside of our own era? And I think the best art, if I had to define it in that way, would be something that brings us outside of our expected or our expectations, our expected reality, our current way of interpreting the world, things that jar us, right? That cause us to question the ways that we already accept and interpret our everyday experience.
All right, so for our next question, we have Zara.
Okay, hello, General. To get into the point, first of all, also completely love your work, and I think it's very recognizable work, and once when I see it and see something that you've made, it's very impactful, and you know that this is something that you've made, and just generally big fan of that. But my question in general is, hold on, I'm trying to remember what it was again. Okay, I have two questions. And my first question was, how do you go about building big sets like you did for the Dior men's show? That was huge. What's the process behind that, and time period, and how does that entire thing work? And second question, which is more deeper question, is how would you say you would go about building this niche for yourself, especially for people who do not want to work in a very defined role per se? They want to do so many different things. And how would you say you've gone about building a name for yourself in this very niche place you exist in?
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the set. So Kim Jones, who's the creative director for Dior, he engaged me to work on a full collection with him. So it was everything from the clothing to sneakers and accessories and jewelry. And I also wanted to work with him on the stage design for the show because I felt it was almost like an exhibition of work and could influence the way that everything else in the collection was seen and understood. And there's a company based in Europe called Villa Eugenie, which produces a lot of those fashion shows for Dior and Chanel, Louis Vuitton. And I worked with them basically conceiving the design, but building everything except for the actual sculptural letters and some of the components within it was all constructed in Paris by their team. The other question you had was around how do you build a defined language? How do you build a career in this way? And when I graduated college, I had $700 and I decided to move back to Miami, where I grew up. This was right around the time that Art Basel was beginning in Miami. And I rented a sort of dilapidated house and with friends created a gallery space inside of this house. And we called it The House. We lived upstairs and we would exhibit our work and work of our friends. And it was, for the first year or so, kind of a small, scenario where it was just friends of ours that were coming to exhibitions. But as the momentum grew and we were sort of able to build, in some ways it felt like we weren't waiting for a gallery or a museum or a curator or somebody to come to us. We actually built our own infrastructure, right, to show our work. And I think in some ways that kind of thing might be easier today because of social media, right? You have the ability to reach much wider audiences in more diverse locations. The trick is that everyone else also has that ability. So although you have a wider reach, you're also competing against a much wider pool of people for eyes and attention. But I think the thing that I've always said to students and younger artists is how long it takes to actually arrive at a place where you feel not only comfortable in your own work, but that you're on a path that is relatively stable. I lived in my studio until I was 30. So it was, almost 10 years out of school that I was still basically trying to put everything back into that, everything back into my work. So it takes a while.
Thank you. So now our next question is going to be from Tyler Crow.
Hey, Daniel. You're a huge influence, big fan of yours. I just wanted to ask
Thank you.
Yeah, as a designer, creative director, artist, and a collaborator, how are you able to juggle each direction of your career to still keep each aspect of your work stable?
So I've always tried to, I think especially in the beginning of my career, there's always a sense of there's certain work that you want to make for yourself, and then there's work that you feel you should be making for some other reason. And I always tried to only make things that I wanted to see, that I wanted to see exist in the world, right? Make things that you want or that you need to see exist in the world. And that has led me down, as I said before, down some paths that were not, let's say, approved, right, by peers of mine or other people in the art world. But I always felt that if I felt these things should exist enough, there might be other people that also could experience them in that way. And so the balance for me is done by treating everything in the same way. So my studio, which is in Queens, New York, since the beginning, since I finished school, I went to the studio every day, 5 days a week. I treated it like a real job. I get there at 9 a.m., I leave at 6, and whatever happens in between that, whether it's working on car design or a film or a piece of architecture or a chair or painting, sculpture, all of those things feel the same in some ways. They feel like they might fit in the same universe of creation. And in the beginning, I think trying to show up without anything to do, right? You go to the studio, you may not have an exhibition that you're working towards. Treating it like a practice in that way and forcing myself to continually go and do that, I think has benefited me. Now, things are very much set up in a way that feels structured and stable, and is the best possible scenario for me to be creative and make my work.
All right, thank you. So for our next question, we have Grant Kilgard.
Hey, Daniel. How's it going?
Hi.
Hey. So, two quick questions. So, well, I'd like to first off start by saying I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, so it's like a huge thing for a fellow Ohioan to be here today. Super cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. But I just wanted to ask about like being interdisciplinary and being kind of like a jack of all trades. I'm kind of like all over the place. And I was wondering if in your career, did you choose your path or did you let it choose you? And my second question is, are you hiring studio interns?
Okay, I'll start with the first question.
For sure.
So, I studied, as I said, at Cooper Union, and my degree was not in a specific area. So in some art schools, you major in painting or sculpture. Cooper was very much about the idea, the concept, and the vehicle of that could be anything, could be a painting or a car design or whatever the actual medium of it was less important. And I think that has been very instructive for me in thinking about all of these different paths. Feeling, I guess you could say it's interdisciplinary, but really I have a very focused idea of what I want to do in my work, right? A lot of the things have similar design parameters and ethos around them, and there's similar ideas in the works that I do in a car, in a chair, in a painting, and so they don't really feel separate in that way. And I guess I could say some of these mediums came to me, and certain projects have come to me that have introduced me to new possibilities of making. And a great many of them were things that I tried out for a number of years before I actually felt that I could show them publicly, right? Gotcha. My studio is filled with failures and things that I tried that didn't work. And occasionally those things, sit around for a year, 2 years, 5 years, and I might revisit them and come back to them. And it's the same way that, as an artist, I think it's really important to keep a notebook and a sketchbook. And I've done that since I was in high school. And I will very regularly go back to notebooks that I kept 20 years ago. And there may be ideas in them that I couldn't realize in that era, in that moment, for whatever reason, for lack of resources or finances or space or technical know-how that I'm now able to achieve. And to the second point, no interns, but whenever I post job listings for the studio, they're always posted on NYFA, which is New York Foundation for the Arts.
Sweet. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to have a question from Julian Corey.
Hello. It seems that you tend to enjoy long-term personal creative collaborations from Kim Jones to Sammy Ross. So my question is, what kind of elements do you look for within a collaborative relationship?
So I would say that in terms of collaborations with people, the vast majority of them were friends before I began working with them. Samuel Ross is the designer, artist. I don't even know how to really define who he is and what he is, because he's such a polymath and an incredible thinker, right? He studied architecture, but the main vehicle for his creative output has been a brand called Cold Wall. And how would I describe it? It's like a mixture of design, fashion, and architecture. In the last couple of years, he's also done a lot of furniture design. These incredible chairs, which are both functional and contain a multitude of ideas around race and history and design history. So how do I choose these collaborators? They're friends. They're people that I have like-minded ideas with, that I trust, who I believe will enhance my work, who I believe I can bring something to their work, and a lot of it's just conversation.
Okay, so for our next question, we have Nuri Boyan.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for speaking to us today about your work. One thing that our discussion reminded me of is this one way I think of design, where you can either create an object or a space, and like you can consolidate ideas into something that's more contained. For example, like when you make your isolated objects versus something that's more expansive and refers to a context, like the Dior set. And then something I found interesting was you also blur that boundary where you have aspects of both categories, like when you have objects extending from a wall or like emerging from a wall, and you can see the way the wall is like contorting to make this new shape. And I'm wondering if that's a binary you think about, like the object-space boundary, and how you navigate that in your work.
So if you think about the design of a building, right, the only thing that makes it different from the design of like a spoon is scale. Because both of those are things that we interact with physically, right? And I would like to make work that operates on a multitude of scales. And so from the beginning, I've tried to set out projects in my studio that, to use the building and the spoon example, operate on different physical scales, but also operate on different time scales, right? It takes a lot longer to design a building than it does to design a spoon. And having that type of thinking within your own practice, I think, can be helpful, right? There are projects that I work on in the studio that might take 5 years, and there's others that, I can make a drawing in a couple hours. And I think this keeps things moving. It keeps ideas being refreshed. In terms of this understanding of, the difference between, let's say, art and architecture, the artworks that you're referencing that are built into the surface of a wall. I've often had the question because, I guess we could say we're allowed to touch architecture, right? If you walked in a museum, even if you touch the wall, there would not be an issue with that. But if you touch a painting at the Met, the guard might have an issue with that. And in my work, how do you define where is the edge when the artwork is actually engaging the architecture, right? Where does the work stop and the architecture begin? And those sort of problematic questions that you might have as a viewer, that is the work. That is the idea. Like you are reading it when you have those questions. That was a very astute observation.
Thank you.
Now we'll have a question from Joel Young.
Hi. My question is, I think you're a very notable presence in various industries and cultures, and I think I'm wondering that now that you've kind of just been established, do you ever feel pressure in the work you create or in your creative processes to perform a certain way, or that an audience like knowing your work now expects a certain thing, or for you to like produce a certain thing? And if so, like how do you navigate that kind of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and it may shock you to hear that, but in some ways, I never really feel like I'm established, or that I've reached a point where I can sort of sit back and say, okay, now I'm good. I made it here. It feels sort of wrong to have that stance, right? Because it negates the work that goes into to achieving, I guess, that place, right? So I always, I guess, feel like I still have work to do. In terms of like the work itself, you know, many of the types of work that I make sit into these sort of groups of thinking. So I have these architectural anomaly pieces that manipulate the walls. I have this fictional archaeology series that's about the manipulation of time. I have a whole furniture sort of universe that's really about materials and process and making, creating new ways of thinking about materials that are sort of banal, like plywood. And so in each of these buckets, I never really feel like I've exhausted all possibilities within them. Certainly the audience, you know, may have an expectation of what they might want to see, but you know, we can always do exhibitions of work that is older, which I often do. I may do exhibitions that combine, you know, new ideas and some older ideas, and it gives audiences a sense of how I arrived at the new thinking. But each thing is sort of an evolution of the last. It could be a material evolution, right? So I learned things about processes that allow me to advance into new types of sculpture. I just completed a new piece, which you may have seen on Instagram the other day. That's a combination of stainless steel and bronze. And the work looks quite simple, I guess, right? It feels very settled and balanced. But it took like 3 years to perfect how to actually do that, because those two metals shrink at different rates, and calculating the difference between them, allowing the patinas to work correctly. That's a work that it's like an evolution of something that I had already been working on with a different concept.
Thank you.
All right, so our next question is from Anna Richlick.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming to speak today. This was super cool. It's just been really interesting to hear everything you have to say and your answers to everyone's questions. I was just wondering sort of how your work and your past experiences have influenced your work now within sports design, and sort of like where you draw your inspiration when working with the Cavaliers.
Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things about just working in an organization like that, everything that you see on court was designed 2 years before that, right? Because you have the NBA, you have Nike, you have all these different partners. And so it gives me time to sort of really digest and think about where do I think the design evolution should go. And one of the things that I set out to do right when I joined the team was sort of peel things away. And what happened with a lot of the design and the way that the team was communicating, it was a stacking of things. So they had stacked up all these different concepts and design. You know, if we looked at just the logo design, there was like 30 different variations of like use cases for it. There's the main logo, there was this colorway, and the tertiary logo. And when it's presented vertically, it looks like this. And it was all a bit, I think, confusing. And so I didn't want to erase the design ethos. I just wanted to actually like reduce it, right? To pare it back and simplify it. And so I spent, you know, the better part of the first year there really investigating how the symbols that we see on court in the jerseys, in the logos might influence, the way that we think about the team and the way that the team also can represent the city. So over the next year, the core design for next year, we also have something called the City Edition, which is a jersey that we use about 25% of the games, our home games. And we're doing projects that actually integrate with other cultural institutions in Cleveland. So could be things like the museum or our metro parks, things like that tie back into the kind of feeling of the city.
Cool, thank you so much.
Yeah, so we have about 7 more minutes, so if anyone wants to submit like one last question, we'll see if we could get to it. In the meantime, I had a question. You mentioned a lot about how you collaborate with your friends, and success doesn't come from one individual. So could you talk a little bit about your support system and your mentors?
Yeah, I would say, my first sort of significant mentor was Merce Cunningham, the choreographer. And when I began working with him, there was a 60-year age difference between us. He was hugely famous at that time, and it was a quite intimidating entrance for me into that world. But the way that he sort of, I would say, influenced or instructed my work was very much about example. So he never said, do this or do that. He never even said, I think you should do this. He would say, look at the way that the dancers move in this place, or look at how the pacing that I've created in the choreography might influence the way that you think about how the design, the visual design unfolds, right? And he was very much about, or very much thought about how we experience time, actually, how watching dance can compress or expand our experience of that moment. And, I have close relationships with a lot of people actually that are not visual artists. I would say most of my close friends are people in music, people in architecture, a lot of people in fashion. And I think that as a creator, understanding the way that people make meaning through other mediums that are not familiar to me, right, is fascinating. I think probably the most incredible thing for me is the way that musicians, in all forms, make their work, because I have no musical sense, and I've never attempted to enter that space. So it feels very magical to me. Whereas my own practice, making painting and sculpture and drawing, it feels so familiar to me at this point. It's like walking. And that sort of influence that you can get from people where you find something magical in what they're able to bring to the world, those, I think, are the best people to surround yourself with.
Thanks for the answer. And right before we wrap up, I had one last rapid fire question, which is just like, what are you listening to these days? What's your favorite song? That sort of thing.
What have I been listening to? Well, Nigo just came out with an album, which I thought was a really interesting project. Nigo, the Japanese, I don't even know what I would call him, artist, musician, clothing designer, and producer. So he produced an album. Pharrell and Rocky and Ferg and Tyler and all these people are on it. And I think it's just like it's a very interesting way to think about it, a kind of art project or a design project, because Nigo is never heard on it. He doesn't even say anything. And the production on it is also assisted by a number of other creators. So I think for him coming at the idea of an album, right, as as a project rather than thinking about it as a musician was sort of an interesting new way of thinking about music.
Yeah, so if we don't have any more questions, thank you so much for coming today and talking to us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed your time at Design Nation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.